Hello, my name is Nancy Campbell. I'm the program director here at the Independent Film Fest Boston. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you back, and we're so glad that you stuck around for this very special conversation about I Was a Simple Man, which is playing here at IFF Boston 2021. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome director Christopher Makoto Yogi to the screen right now. Welcome, Christopher.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having me, Nancy.
Thank you so much for sharing this film with us. It is such a special film. The title immediately, evokes, I was a simple man. I cannot stop thinking about this quote about simplicity being complexity resolved. Because, simplicity is a very complex issue, and you reveal a lot about your main character, Masao. Can you tell us a little bit about how the origin of this story began with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can talk about the title as well. They're kind of one and the same story, but the film was inspired by my experience of death in the family. About 10 years ago, I experienced just a series of deaths, like just one after the other, that was really disorienting. And I was just, yeah, totally just didn't really know how do I think process. I lost my father to cancer, and then I lost a grandfather to suicide, and then another grandfather to cancer. And I remember that final grandfather. This was around 2009 that I was in his room, and it was the first time it was the first time that I was sort of saw him, who was this very strong sort of a monumental figure in my life. He basically was one of the main people who raised me, but he was just weakened, and he just was just unrecognizable when I walked into the room. And he was speaking to people who weren't there. He was saying phrases in Japanese I didn't understand. At one point, he mistook me for my father and started talking to me as if I were my father, but my father had already passed away. And it was such a at the time, very terrifying, very scary experience. But I think now, in retrospect, I see it as something that was very profound, something that was a very profound thing to be able to witness someone passing over. And so after that experience of being in the room with someone who was passing away, that feeling just stuck with me, and I just wanted to make a film that sort of captured what it felt like to be in the room with someone who's dying. And for me, it was like their entire life was like kind of like closing in on us, like it felt really intense, like it was like this like encroaching bubble. And and so I made a film called Obake in 2011, which is the Japanese word for ghosts. And that was my attempt to sort of capture that feeling. And I thought I was done with the story, but it just stuck with me, and I just kept thinking about the characters. And so about a year later, I sat down and I wrote a feature version of the film, and it just kind of came out of me, you know. It was just stories that I had heard about my grandparents and their lives growing up, stories taken from my family, inspired by my family, characters in my family, memories of my own childhood. And all of this stuff just sort of came out into this one piece. And the title, "I Was a Simple Man," you know, at my grandfather's funeral, this same grandfather that I'm speaking about, that I was in his room, I remember one of my uncles kept saying, he was such a simple man. He was such a simple man. And I remember sitting in the audience and thinking, I don't think he was. Like, I think he was a very complicated man. I mean, I had a very complicated relationship with him. And so that just stuck with me as I was writing the film, that from the outside, it might look like a very simple man and a very simple life, but obviously nothing is as simple as we think it is.
You mentioned the complicated relationship that you had with your grandfather. And I think that what is so special about this film is the complicated relationships that Masao has with like his children,
Yeah.
and his other family members, that you really explore in a way that I don't think a lot of films do. I think that it is very difficult, especially, you know, like I had a very complicated relationship with my own father, and when he
Hmm.
passed away, like you mourn, but you mourn in a very complicated way,
Yeah.
because you love them. But like, it is so interesting how you portrayed them, and um, I think that is really special. Can you talk about how
Hmm.
you develop those characters from that experience?
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely agree. It, it took me a long time to sort of process the deaths that I experienced in my life. It definitely was not something that, I mean, I still I think I'm still processing it on some level, still unpacking a lot of the relationships, a lot of my life living with my father, my grandfathers. And this film, I think, was in a weird way, like, I think it sort of helped me to sort of process a lot of my feelings about my family, about my relationships with them. And it's interesting as the film, as time moved on, the film would change its meaning. Like I feel like the first draft I wrote, which was many years ago, was a much darker film in a lot of ways, a much maybe more angry film. Um, and I think that's just because that's where I was in that period of mourning. And I think now it's a much I at least I think it's a much less judgmental film. And I think maybe even hopeful in the end. And I hope that communicates, because I do feel like that's kind of honest to what I feel about life and death and my relationships at this point in my life. So it's really interesting. So I think the way that I sort of approached the film was just trying to be honest with what I'm feeling, and as I was writing it, as I was making it, and just checking in with myself. Does this feel honest to my experience? Does this feel honest to my relationships? And that was my way of sort of navigating, the complexities of the relationships, and whether or not how the characters are portrayed on screen, and so on.
You have a lot of visuals that include, moving from light to dark. There's always this shift. Um, and, Grace has a painting of an eclipse, and, Masao, as a younger version of himself, witnesses or observes the eclipse as well. And there's just elements that are moving over each other constantly, in the way that like sort of leaves, branches move through and darken and
Yeah.
lighten your environment. Can you talk about those fluxes of light and dark that you use throughout the film?
Yeah, I really like the word you used, flux. I think I never thought of it in that terms, but I think the film what I'm constantly look at is just constant transitions. Like I'm like this film is about a transition, one of the most major transition of one's existence, and I think that transitions abound every day, and I think that's what this film was about, was just exploring those transitions. And I think that with the eclipse, I think there's just something really beautiful about having having nature just play almost in uh, almost like it's almost instigating action in a way. And having just nature, the sky, the land, the leaves, all of these things be just a major presence in in the visual and oral, like, sort of approach, or form of the film, was really important to us. And so I think even in the writing, I was constantly looking at the ways in which I could incorporate um, just the environment, just the island, or in this case, just like celestial events, in ways that feel like you're constantly aware of the way in which the world is moving and the world is changing and everything is in flux.
Mhm. Well, in addition to those sort of uses of light, what is also very notable about this film is your use of sound. And for me, especially the sound of the wind, which always evokes, the first time I think I noticed wind in a film as sort of a character was in the Japanese film Onibaba. And,
Oh, interesting.
and you see a lot of it in Kurosawa films and stuff, that they move through the reeds, and I was very distinctly aware of the elements that usually were preceded by the sound of wind, when you have rain. Can you talk about like designing the sound that you move throughout? Because, it moves
Yeah.
through these very natural sounds into these very like supernatural like sounds,
Yeah.
where it moves into being more of a ghost story.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I that's so interesting that you made the connection to Japanese cinema. I personally did not make that connection, but that's really cool. For us, it was really the approach was really uh, always feeling the presence of the island. So even if you're inside, I wrote a film that's set in Hawaii, and then I like half of it is set in a room, and so I thought, how am I gonna make sure that the presence of the island is still there even when we're inside? I mean, obviously with the production design, the house is a major character, and that was all really important to capturing this sort of Hawaiian feel, but just feeling the wind, hearing the waves, hearing just like little bits and pieces of the outside world at all times was really important to us. And so we just made a very it was something that we just in our sound design we were very conscious of always making sure that you felt the island. And of course then because it's sound, and sound is so I mean, to me, like, I personally feel sound is more important to cinema than the image, and it's so much more subconscious. It like cuts to somewhere really deep that usually you don't know that it's doing that work on you.
Mhm.
And so then of course when we decided to use sound in this very forward way, then it's about like, okay, now using the sound to hit on the emotions that we want to hit in the moment. So hopefully, in the moments that we want you to feel a sadness, that the environment, those like natural sounds are evoking a sort of sadness in some way. And then in the more heightened sort of fear, like Masao's like fear is really gripping him, then we use a sort of a much more heightened, surreal sound design. And our sound designer Sungrock is someone that I've been working with for like almost 15 years now, and so we have just a working method that I just trust him so much. And so for me with this film, I was kind of like, you like we figure out what we want to do, and then you just be creative, like let the genius do his work. And I was like blown away when I was listening to his work. It's just so beautiful and so moving.
Yeah, like I mentioned, it is almost its own character throughout.
Yeah.
It definitely moves you through those spaces and through his transitions. Um, and, there's so many things I want to talk about. But like,
Yeah.
uh, I think that like one of the great things that film can do is transport an audience, especially like an audience that right now is watching your film from like way across the country in an
Yeah.
entirely different like location. We have completely different flora and fauna. Like everything about this environment is very different than your environment. So,
Mhm.
but, a lot of us may have perceptions about Hawaii, and you really show Hawaii that is outside the frame of a picture postcard, outside of what
Mm.
you might get as like a tourist who visits Hawaii. Like
Mhm.
visit Hawaii with any frequency, which I've been lucky enough to do because I do have family there as well.
Mhm.
You sense, uh, for me, I've always sensed a melancholy, and that melancholy like exists as a result of
Mm.
a traumatic history. Um,
Mhm.
as
Absolutely.
um, it is kind of a stolen sovereignty.
Mhm.
So touch upon those issues of its statehood
Mhm.
briefly, and can you talk about the way you frame Hawaii and getting those other elements in there? Like you don't like linger on them, but you do suggest them.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, um, yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because it's not something I get to talk about a lot, first of all, and it is something that's very important to the film. I mean, for me, my work over the past decade or so has been about just really portraying my home in a way that feels lived in, feels honest to my experience, feels recognizable to my experience growing up there. And of course, growing up, like I almost wouldn't even watch the other movies that were that were set there because I would just assume that it's that they just get it wrong. That it's not, or not necessarily get it wrong, but it's just it probably wouldn't resonate with my experience. That's not to say that that's untrue and that other people can't have that experience. Of course they can. But for me, I just was really looking at a way in which I can capture what I felt growing up there, my memories, my emotions, my sort of my truth, being born and raised there. And so that was always the compass, like making the short films before then, making my first feature, August at Akiko's, making this film. Like it was always about just really trying to capture a certain feeling that just felt honest to my experience. And part of that is a real. There's sort of two sides to it, and part of it is a real sense of trauma that you speak about, and this trauma that's very much really just embedded in the land, I think, and it comes from a very traumatic history of a monarchy being overthrown, land being stolen from outside forces, colonialism, militarism, all of these sort of traumas, one after the other, capitalism, and then overdevelopment, luxury tourism, like all of these things, just like one after the other, just beating the sort of culture to death. And for a long time, Native Hawaiians weren't able to speak their language. They weren't able to dance hula in the way that they wanted to, in the way that was traditional. It's when I think on it, I just think that most folks who come to the islands, they get the like you said, the postcard, they get the experience that's very much putting them in a bubble. And I get why maybe you, if you're on vacation, maybe you wouldn't want to deal with all this heavy stuff. But I do think that it's important, if you're coming to a space, I think it's important that it becomes a dialogue, like, and it doesn't just become this sort of like take. It becomes like you come, you experience something, but you can also learn. You can talk to some people, you can learn about the history. And I think it'll make the experience so much more rich. And there's so much richness in Hawaii. And so making a film in Hawaii that doesn't touch upon that history, upon that sadness that you speak about, I feel like it has to be there, because it is there. I think if once you turn on a camera and start filming the landscape, it's hard not to feel that, at least for me. And then the other thing that I feel very heavily when I'm there is a real sense of like almost like a spiritual communion with nature. And I think that that's just because it is amazing to be in nature, and it's such a beautiful place. And that's something that I feel, and so I try to capture that as well in the work that I'm doing. And I think, at least I hope, that the film is dealing with a lot of heavy subjects, death, shame, fear, but I hope that this sort of sense of spiritual beauty that I think is present in the Hawaiian Islands gives it a sense of lightness, or a sense of at least hope, or so it's not also heavy, that was the intent, at least.
I think that, well, this, I don't want this to become just like an ad for like Hawaii, but I think that Hawaii is an extraordinary place, and that there is always an optimism there. There's always a rainbow, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of rain, a lot of rainbows, but like, you always sense that the land is being built under your feet in Hawaii. That like there's a volcano that is making new land. As you are there, like you feel like
it's alive.
It's alive. You feel like, I feel like when I'm there, I'm the closest to the earth that I've ever been.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Which is one of the extraordinary things about being there. And I think that like, you do get a sense of that in this film, about like this turn, this movement, always underneath, like when things are being destroyed, new things are being built. And so I've totally probably gone off where, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and kind of go back to the concept of ghosts. and
Hmm.
apparitions. In sort of the Western world, ghosts are kind of seen with this malevolence, that but like sort of there is a rich tradition in Hawaii that probably stems back a lot to Japanese folklore as well, of ghost stories. And in those ghost stories, they're very human based ghosts, most of them with unfinished business that they kind of have to get through. A lot of them, I think, kind of like for me, this all stems from a little bit of like, I think the Legends of Tono. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but like,
No.
it's like this Japanese set of folklores that were recaptured by, what is his name? I'm going to mess it up. I think I wrote it down. And it doesn't matter. Anyway, he kind of recaptured sort of these old stories in a rural part of Japan at a time when like Tokyo and Osaka were being sort of built up, and he wanted to reestablish the connection to the land to people who are now dwelling in the city. So, Yanagita, he collected these
Cool.
stories and definitely tried to promote them as a way to reconnect with the past. And those stories are moralistic, and at the center of them are always common people. And he strongly believed that, like, by telling these stories, these folklores, that had been in the oral tradition, and sharing them and reigniting people's interest in them, that he would be refocusing and recentering narratives, not on the ruling class, not on like the people, who were high up in society, but to the common
Huh.
people. And I think it's a really interesting connection to make, that you're telling this ghost story and recentering it on a very human and like story. Like Masao is a very common person, one that,
Yeah.
he lives in a house that you would definitely see in Hawaii. Like a lot of people live in similar houses.
Yeah.
And can you touch upon telling a very like human scaled story?
Yeah, no, I love that. That connection. It's so interesting. So like the ghost story telling culture in Hawaii is so vibrant, right? Like it's just something that I grew up with, just always hearing ghost stories. It's something like that. Grandparents, parents would tell friends, folklorists, you'd always have folklorists coming through. Even at school, we'd have people come through and just like tell all these stories. And it'd be like, that block over there, that like something happened over there, like, down the street over there, something happened over there. And I loved it. Like as a kid, I loved it. And even as like a teenager, like we would like go to these like to these like haunted places just to like try and see or commune with the ghosts. Just something that was so fun, or yeah, just such a vibrant culture. And it's inspired by Native Hawaiian mythology mixed with, like you said, Japanese ghost stories that came with the Japanese immigrants, Chinese stories, and then you have the Western stories as well. And it's all like blended into this stew that's very, very interesting. And as I got older, I started to reflect upon the ways in which this sort of storytelling, the trading of ghost stories, the telling of ghost stories, were a way of like sort of passing on culture. A way of passing culture through the generations in a way that was fun and that you would learn. I mean, you'd learn about Hawaiian gods and goddesses, about the mythology of Native Hawaii, and and so the way in which ghost story is used as sort of an oral history, I became very fascinated with. It plays such an integral part in just talk story mo'olelo in Hawaii. Um, and so when I decided to make a film about ghosts, I knew that it wasn't going to be a film that was necessarily a traditional ghost storytelling. It was one that's going to more reflect this very like accepting sort of accepting of ghosts, accepting of ghost storytelling, like just like it's there and we just accept that it's there. And then I was thinking a lot actually about Miyazaki, and the way in which in his world, the supernatural is right there, and all it takes is just a little bit of like a turn of your perspective, and then it's there and you see it. And I feel that resonated with me when I'm in Hawaii. It's like I feel like it's there. It just takes a little bit of like thinking differently or looking differently or opening something differently. And so that was sort of the approach that we used when we were crafting the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that is remarkable, as well as how all of it's like a film that dwells like in the same space, and sometimes you see a glimmer of it.
Yeah.
And I think you have some characters that kind of are able to see that more, like that are sort of introduced, briefly.
Yeah.
Akiko, which I believe is somebody that was in your previous film.
Yeah.
She sees like these apparitions and like accepts them, and kind of tries to plead with Masao that he needs to let them in,
Yeah.
and I think it's interesting that, obviously there's fear and there's superstition, and he puts the salt to a barrier around, and and moves it. But like also the dog is aware, and his son, who you see briefly speaking to the tree in the film, to communicate with his mother. Like they live in that space where they also recognize that all of this is around them.
Yes. Yeah.
So those are really interesting elements that you intimate this ghost story constantly throughout, and he becomes less and less fearful because he recognizes that they're not malevolent, and Grace is there to kind of usher him through and sort of pacify him, and he's dealing with a lot. This is me just commenting constantly. I'm sorry.
No, that's great.
This film is great. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, well after I saw it. I think that like, there's so much to dwell on. Can you talk, I'll go into some nuts and bolts questions. Like, can you talk about casting? Can you talk about how you got these people to be in your film? And let's just start.
Yeah. Absolutely. The lead, Steve, it was his first film. And I met him at a Japanese bone dance, which is like a Japanese festival of the dead, kind of festival of ancestors. Like you like sing, eat, or you dance. Yeah, you dance, eat food. It's fun. And so like summer festival. So we were at a bone dance, and we were basically there casting, and we saw this guy dancing, and we thought he like was just so charismatic and amazing. And we asked him if he ever considered acting in a movie before, and he said like, I've always had a dream I'd like of acting in a movie someday. So he was like totally game to come audition for us. And it was a long process of doing many auditions to make sure that he was the right Masao. But after that, after we decided that he was our Masao, it was like I go back and forth between Hawaii and the continent, and every time I was in Hawaii, it would be like we'd meet up, we'd do some exercises, we'd do some rehearsals. It was like acting school for him, and this was like we cast him in like 2016, I want to say. So like over the course of years, slowly working with him to like build up this character. And then of course I'm like changing the script to kind of fit him a little bit and doing that sort of thing. And it was just such a fun process to work with him over the course of many years to find this character. And I think, I think it was like a week before production or something, he said he told me he started dreaming in character, dreaming as Masao. And I thought that was so incredible, that he was going there so deeply. And I also felt bad because it's such a dark character to be like, he's an older guy, he's contemplating his mortality. And Steve, the actor, is such a happy-go-lucky, very positive. He's very much not Masao, interestingly enough. He's so different, which makes his performance all the more remarkable. And so that, that's something that was just a really pleasurable and fulfilling partnership to make the film with him. And then Constance was similar. I worked with her in the Sundance directing lab, which was way back in 2015. And I cast her for this role of Grace based on my grandmother, whose name was Grace. And I didn't really know what the role was. I just knew it was his wife who had passed away and that she was returning as a ghost. But I remember the first time we like put up a scene with Constance, and I remember like the shot, like it was like, just a shot of her when she like first like arrives, I think, and it was so powerful. And like I think our like script supervisor was like in tears. Like it was just such a beautiful performance, and it was almost as like the character then like made sense to me. I was like, oh, I see. Like she's like this almost like the spine of this movie. And so after that, we, you know, over the course of the workshop, we would work on this character. And when the lab was over, I asked her if she wanted to be involved in the feature film. She said yes. And then it took many, many years for it to get made. And you know, props to her. She still wanted to do it when we went into production in 2019. So both those characters were long gestating sort of characters that grew and sort of evolved over the years, very much inspired by the people who were playing those roles.
You have a lot of versions of Masao. Like you have, you know, Masao,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
a mid Masao and like a high school-ish Masao,
yeah.
and also younger Grace, and they're
Hmm.
often, you know, in positions. Well, they get to positions where they are confronting themselves or different
Hmm.
versions of themselves throughout the film. Um, and I think that one of the things that really struck me is, you know, Grace talking to younger Grace, who's painting
Yeah, yeah,
the lunar eclipse, and you know, asking her, "Am I Pow yet? Am I done?"
yeah, yeah,
And she says no, and then later yes. And I think that we talk a little bit about determining how you wanted those confrontations to work.
yeah. It's funny. The film sounds crazy as you explain it. Yeah, but it. You know, it very much was this feeling that, you know, it was this feeling like when I was with my grandfather in the room, even when I was with my father, like it felt like they were going back in time, definitely. Like it felt like they were time traveling. And so I began to just imagine that they were embodying different versions of themselves in those sort of psychedelic time travel sort of end of life visions. And I just wanted to capture that. And I just think about the ways in which even, you know, even people who aren't at the end of life, like even me now, for example, like you're constantly like, I think, confronting or negotiating with your past self and who you were before, and constantly trying to like become something better or become something new or learn or grow. And that always means sort of some kind of internal, almost like there's many yous inside of you that's constantly negotiating with one another. I just want to capture that in some way. And because it's cinema, you can just do it. You can just you can just have the older version talk to the younger version, and why not? You know, you can do it. So it was it was like a sort of a interesting I don't want to say risk, but an interesting sort of um, uh, uh, decision to go there where we just have all the characters across time just all in the same space, you know. But when we shot it, I saw it and I felt it. I was like, oh, this is way more powerful than I could have even imagined on the page. Like having all these different versions of themselves is something really, really intense. And I think the final version also has that power, and it's really, to me, even surprising. Like I didn't think it would have that sort of power, but
It
it does.
definitely has a lot of power to see them, and to see things that are, like you say, like with film, you do have the ability to kind of like really play with the temporal plane. You know,
Yeah,
play with time in a way that you can't in almost any other medium. Um,
Yeah.
and and that makes a lot of sense for the kind of story that you're telling and the experience that Masao is going through. Like as as like that leak in the ceiling, time is trickling through, and his
Yeah.
memories are trickling through. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that it is really fascinating, and this is also just me talking about your film more. Like when young Masao, young Grace are sitting on the beach, and you see the hula dancers. Like, to me, that's one of the most like uh, powerful scenes, that it suggests what we spoke about earlier,
Hmm.
about that trauma and that memory still existing in the land,
Hmm.
and they're observing it in that
Hmm.
moment. um, I don't even know if I'm making a point to get to another thing, but I really thought that was very beautifully done, and I think that you made a lot of really interesting choices in telling, um, in showing that journey to the end of a person's life. For me, I'm also switching directions because that's what I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think that also one of the things that really struck me was the insertion of the character of his grandson, Gavin. I think that was his.
Yeah. Gavin.
Gavin, does that reflect kind of the way you were feeling when you were taking care of your grandfather?
Yeah.
It's a young person being thrust into the role of a caretaker, and it's so like far removed from their experience, and really exposes them to something that, like you mentioned, is very scary. um, can you just talk about
Yeah,
that?
yeah, no, it definitely, I mean, it definitely was inspired by my relationship with my grandfather. Someone who felt both there and also distant at the same time somehow, like someone who was always there and yet somehow like this my grandfather was the one that I'm thinking of as was a very like, almost like a samurai Japanese old school guy. Like didn't really express his emotions, didn't really open up,
Very
but was
stoic.
fun, was very stoic but was fun sometimes, but never, not really like sensitive or vulnerable. And then to see him vulnerable all of a sudden was very surprising and almost terrifying. I never was like the sole caretaker of my grandfather when he was in that state. My cousin was though, and she's around my age, and so I was kind of thinking like, man, what was it like for her? She was taking care of him. I was in film school at the time, so I visited, but she had been there for like a month at that point. And so I kind of was just putting myself into her, like her headspace, but also just conjuring the feelings of fear that I had. I don't know if she felt fear, but I certainly did when I entered that space. Um, and so that really was where that character came from.
Um, I think, also one of the most powerful things that happened is when he just embraces Gavin, you know,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
and you wonder, like, is he embracing Gavin just because he's embracing Gavin and he feels,
yeah,
uh, you know, um, that closeness, or is that just some of the other memories just sort of lingering? You wonder what the intent is, or if it's
yeah,
all blended together
yeah,
um, in that moment, and it's very emotional to see that happen. And
yeah,
I think also, it generally generationally, a Japanese man or a man of Japanese descent, uh, there's not a lot of expressed emotion a lot of times.
absolutely. Yeah.
So when you are seeing those kind of things start to break down, um,
Mhm.
it, it it is unnerving.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely like that isn't like a that kind of embrace is not something that would have happened in the years when I was growing up with my grandfather. And so to give them a moment of connection in that way, even though all it is an embrace, something that we do all the time, or we did before COVID, all the time. because it's those particular characters and because of their history and their culture, it becomes something that's almost like a bridging of time, or like or not a total sense of forgiveness, or not a total sense of closure, but something, it's and then that little something ends up being a lot, it ends up being everything. um, yeah.
Definitely. It is very powerful. I think those are kind of the main things I want to talk about, but I guess sort of starting to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to talk to you about like letting people know what's going to happen with this film next, what kind of projects you're working on in the future, or if there's anything you're working on currently that they can keep an eye out for. I'm hoping that this will, you know, gain an opportunity for you to be on the radar of people who didn't know what kind of work you were making, and look forward to what you're doing next.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, we're we're finalizing our distribution now, so it's not nothing has been announced yet. But if everything goes according to plan, it will have a release later this year. Fingers crossed, that cinemas open and people want to go see films in theaters. I would love for folks to be able to experience this one in a cinema, because like you said, the sound design, the images, we made it for in a cinema. And just we like this idea of turning the cinema space into one in which is one in which you can have a sort of journey of I don't know, like confronting your own fears or your own experiences of death in the family within the presence of others who are also probably going through their own sort of journey of alongside Masao and alongside the family members. This was always the goal of the film, and so we can't wait for folks to be able to see it in the theater. So fingers crossed that all happens. And then for me, I have some other film ideas that I'm kicking around that I've been developing over the years, Hawaii based, and then some that are not Hawaii based but are telling Asian American stories. And so all those ideas are quite early, but I'm gonna be diving into them this year, and hope that in the next few years I'll have another film that deals with probably the same sort of themes, like me just trying to portray Hawaii in a way that's honest to my experience, and that really explores the rich culture. There's so many stories, so many cultures, such a diversity and richness of story. There's just so much to tell and so much to explore. So if if I keep hitting that well, like, I'm gonna be okay. There's just so much there. And I also want to just urge folks to check out work from other filmmakers in Hawaii. There are so many amazing filmmakers in the islands who are doing the same thing that I am, just telling their personal story of what Hawaii means to them, what their home means to them. A lot of them from a native Hawaiian angle, and it's beautiful. Actually, there's a program on Criterion Channel right now of Native Hawaiian shorts, and I would really suggest people go check it out. They're amazing, and it kind of gives you this sort of like my work is like one piece of a very rich, three-dimensional filmmaking community that's doing a lot of cool stuff. So go check that out.
That's a really great suggestion. I think that like that is also the great thing about film festivals and meeting people like you, is that you keep opening the window a little bit wider so we can see more of the scope of the world. I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing your film. We're extremely honored, and we will make sure that everybody who's watching this will have to tell their friends that when the film gets released, to watch it as well, and keep spreading the word.
Yes.
So thank you again.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This was a really cool conversation. I'm so happy to be screening this for your audiences.